So in this tutorial, we are going to learn the basics of Figma, and at the same time, we are going to learn how we can translate what we draw or design in Figma into HTML and CSS. So if you're already familiar with Figma, you know that you can draw shapes in Figma, and Figma allows you to have basically a canvas to play around. So here, if I go ahead and click on a rectangle shape here, as soon as I try to draw a shape, Figma immediately gives it some width and height values. And if you can't see that, you can always take a look at the right hand side. You see we have the layouts, which is width set to 278 pixels, and then we have our height, which is set to 262 pixels. Also, you have the ability to click and drag and freely move the shape around. Also here you see that we have coordinates, but the way that the web development works, we don't really care about the coordinates because your web development items, they are created and they are added to the page without actually having the coordinates in mind. You care about the coordinates if you do want to use animation when it comes to web development. Also, if I go ahead and use the dev mode in Figma here, if I click on the dev mode, I think you should have a Pro license to be able to see the dev mode. And if I click on the dev mode, here you see on the right hand side, the code that is generated is width and height. And then again, if we take a closer look at the right hand side, we see that it's actually being generated to rem. Rem is a value in CSS. We'll get into that later on. But for you to know as a designer, anything that you create on the website or in a web application that is browser based has a width and height. Also, we have again something called the box model, which is set to border box. Here, again, this value is really important when it comes to CSS and web development. So if you are a designer and you have designed a button, how would you translate that into CSS and HTML? So let's just go ahead and delete that for now. Let's just create a button, our first project. Okay, here we just call this button. And then in Figma, if you want to basically create a text object, you can press T on your keyboard. And as soon as you press T on your keyboard, you'll be able to basically have a text object created. And then you have to go to basically the V, which is move tool, to be able to select that. Again, if you are a designer, this may seem too obvious, but if you are a developer, that might be intimidating because you're used to coding. So you're not comfortable using a graphical user interface. So as a developer, if you're the first time using Figma, make sure to click the move tool or this hand shape and then be able to basically select your items. And then as soon as you select your button, you can hold Shift and A. Again, this would create an auto layout frame. So you have more functionality when it comes to auto layout containers, because auto layout is exactly like a frame, but just gives you more superpower. And as soon as you create an auto layout frame, again, on the right hand side, we see that our auto layout panel is created for us. So if I go ahead and just modify the text value and then just write sign up for our button. So here I have the button sign up created. I need to click on my parent frame. Again, on the left hand side, here is our layer panel. You have basically pages and layers. Here on the layer panel, I have my auto layout frame created. And then if you notice that this tiny icon is basically an auto layout frame, if you create a normal frame here on the bottom hand of your screen, you can create a normal frame. And then here you see that the icon is different on both of them. So I'm going to delete this normal frame just to show you that there is a difference between the normal frame and the auto layout frame. Also, if you're using the previous version of Figma, if I go back to the previous version, the layer panel is basically snapped to the top. You have to basically click on the pages to be able to see your pages and layers. On the newer version of Figma, it's actually designed in a better way. So now you have layers and pages. So this way you can basically collapse them. In the previous version, you wouldn't be able to. Also, the auto layout is pretty much the same. The only difference is Figma brought the width and height to the auto layout box. If I go ahead and switch to the previous version, here you see we don't have the width and height under the auto layout panel. And also the fill and hug properties with the width and height is also placed all the way to the top. So all these four properties are now under auto layout box. Again, this is the previous version. If I go to the new one, here you see now we have the width and height, again, as well as the fill and hug properties all within the auto layout box. So I created my frame, which is an auto layout frame. And then as soon as you create an auto layout frame, you would be able to give it padding. And padding is what we use as developers in web development. So here, if I go ahead and click plus, I would be able to add a fill, because if I add a padding, you might not be able to see it. Let's just go ahead with the red color. So I'll just go FF0000. So I have a red button. And if I try to zoom in, again, if you're a developer and you're using this for the first time, you can hold Command on your keyboard and you can use your basically mouse scroll wheel to basically zoom in and out, or if you're using a trackpad, you can pinch to zoom in and out. I'm using a mouse and keyboard, so I'm holding Command on my keyboard and using the scroll wheel to zoom in. So now I have my button created. So if I click on the frame, just double click, rename this to button, and if I go to the dev mode, now I see more properties are being generated for me by Figma. One of the properties is called a background. So in web development, we basically give colors to our items using a background color or background. You can use both of them interchangeably when it comes to the CSS, but when it comes to Figma, you don't have that option. You have to go under fill. Here, once you go under fill, you would be able to add a background color to your frame. Also here on the auto layout, you see that we have this padding options, top and bottom, left and right. So if I click on that tiny icon on the right side, which is individual padding, I'm able to modify them individually. But usually for a button, you want to have the top and bottom paddings to be the same value and the left and right to be the same. So I'm going to collapse that. And then for the left and right, I would just give it 8, for example. And then for the top and bottom, I'm going to go with 4 pixels. Right now we see our button created. And if I go back to the dev mode, here you see that the buttons, the way the padding is being highlighted is actually not correct, which is 0.5 or 0.25. Well, behind the scene, developers have multiple options. They can either use the pixel values or they can use something called rem. Rem allows them to basically define a fixed pixel value in their code and then multiply that by the values here. So for example, if I go ahead and click on that tiny icon on the top right, here you see I have to be again on the dev mode. I have the ability to basically toggle between pixel and rem. Here the default is set to rem. Again, I can click on the unit setting, and then right now I see that it is set to 16 because the default value of the root elements is 16 pixels on a web browser. So if you do the math, if 16 times 0.5, it would give you 8 pixels. And if I basically close that and go back, here we have 8 pixels on the right and left side. Also 16 times 0.25 will give us 4. Again, if I go back, we have 0.25 on top and bottom. And you can always toggle between these values. You can again go click on this in inspect settings. And once you click on that, you can go back to pixel. And once you go back to pixel, you see the values are updated. And now I see the values being shown as pixel, which is 8 and 8 and 4 and 4 on top and bottom. And what you notice is, again, once we add the padding, we have again something else, which is the total width and the total height. Is set to 61 pixels and 23 pixels. So this width and height is automatically calculated because of the content that we have inside our button. So we can override that behavior if we go back and basically click and drag our button. If you want to duplicate something in Figma, you can hold Option and basically have your cursor being doubled. Again, here I'm holding Option, and as soon as I hover over my button, my cursor is changed into a double cursor. That means I'm going to duplicate this. So I'm going to click and drag, and I have duplicated another button. As soon as I click and drag that, I want you to pay attention to the right side. Here we have again 61 pixels and it's set to hug. Here we have hug content. Again, if I click outside and if I try to drag that, as soon as I drag that, my width has changed to a fixed value. And if I click on the drop down, you see right now I no longer have this set as hug. I have set this as a fixed width. This means that the width of this entire button is no longer calculated based on the padding. So it really doesn't matter if you give the left and right padding like 16 or 0. It has no effect on how your button is being stretched. However, if I click on the top one, and if I click and drag the padding, you see I have the ability to control the total width of this button, because the width of this button is calculated automatically based on the padding size. However, the button down below is calculated based on the fixed value that I'm giving the button. Also, the button on top, and if I take a look at the typography section here, you see that we have something called the line height, and line height is set to auto. But if I go ahead and put a fixed value like 20 pixels, you see that the size of the button up top is changed as well. So here, if I go ahead and click and drag it, you see the button on the left hand side basically increases in width and also in height, and that is controlled because we are controlling the way the content is being preserved, and the whole width and height of this entire button is automatically calculated using the paddings. So if I go ahead, click here, and for example, give it 12 pixels, we're basically back to the original value. Usually the original value is set to 100% or auto, but for now, I'll just give it 20 pixels. But for now, I'll just leave the line height as 12 pixels. However, if I click on my button below, if I go ahead and set that to a fixed value, and if I try to resize this, again, if I click on the actual text and I make the line height 60 pixels, you see it overflows. And it really, again, doesn't matter if your entire button has a bigger line height, it's going to overflow because the width is no longer calculated based on the padding. It is calculated based on the fixed value that you give the button. So I'm going to basically put that back to auto. Here it snaps back. And for the second button, I can just simply click here, just go with 0000 double F, and I would create my blue button. In the upcoming videos, I would like to basically take these two buttons that I created and try to convert them into HTML and CSS. And if you're not familiar with HTML, CSS, I'll try to walk you through how they are connected with Figma and how they are connected in web development in general.